The COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted education and upended lives of children around the world. Never before have so many children been out of school at the same time. Many countries have opted to keep schools closed for nearly a year now. As we enter the second year of the pandemic, the debate on opening schools continues. So does closing schools really slow down transmission? What does the latest evidence say? Robert Jenkins, the Global Chief of Education at UNICEF, joins us today to address the uncertainty students, teachers, and parents are facing. Robert, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Priyanka.
Robert, what would you say to parents who are worried and wondering whether it's safe to send their children to school?
Well, first of all, being a parent myself, I know how challenging it has been. The daily struggle to continue to have each and every child to continue to learn at this time has been incredibly challenging and stressful each and every day. When it comes to school reopenings, what do we know about the impact of school closure on children? We've got to recognize that goes well beyond the impact on learning. The fact is that schools are much more than just classrooms. And this last year has made that very, very apparent and real for all of us. These continue to be places where children get often their only nutritious meal for many marginalized children, where they get vaccinated, but also where they receive psychosocial and mental support. So a school closing down is not just a temporary inconvenience, it can change the course of a child's life. There's growing evidence that schools are not the drivers of the pandemic. And yet, in many countries, governments and partners are still opting to keep schools closed, sometimes for more than a year. So it's absolutely critical in any lockdown situation that schools are the last thing to close and the first thing to reopen. Of course, it's also important that schools take a full range of measures to help keep children safe.
Robert, let's talk about the cost of school closures that you mentioned. At the peak of the pandemic, lockdowns affected 90% of students worldwide and left at least 1/3 of school children with no access to remote education. Help us understand just how devastating this has been and what the long-term impact of this past year would be on an entire generation.
Well, we really can't overstate just how devastating or what a negative impact school closures have already had, and the impact this could potentially have on a generation of students. To put it simply, we see there was an existing global learning crisis, and now we have a crisis on top of a crisis. You mentioned that at least 1/3 of school children had no access to remote education during the school closures last year, but nearly 3/4 of those children globally are from the poorest households. So the ones that are most impacted are the children who are already furthest behind and already facing very real challenges. So let me just touch on two of the many long-term impacts. One is the risk of increasing dropouts. And there's some estimates now that is at least 24 million children are projected to drop out of school and never return due to disruption caused by COVID-19. And number two is the potential for increasing poverty rates. As a result of the lost learning and as I mentioned, in the potential of dropping out of school, many of these children could face lifelong poverty. If today's students don't learn the skills that they need to successfully transition into life and work, our communities and businesses will very much be affected.
That's really disturbing. So we're really at a point where school closures are threatening irreversible harm to an entire generation. Robert, UNICEF is calling for teachers to be prioritized to receive the COVID-19 vaccine once frontline health workers and high-risk populations are vaccinated. Talk us through why it's so important to protect our teachers.
Well, one thing that we have seen during the disruption of COVID-19 on schooling, and we've all increasingly recognized, is the central role teachers play in each of our child's life, but in the communities as a whole. And so immunizing teachers is absolutely critical in order to protect them from community transmission so that they can carry out this very important role. Teacher absenteeism due to COVID-19 has contributed to either school-wide shutdowns or closing of certain classes, and again, then creating disruption to children's learning. So we want to keep teachers protected from the virus so they can continue to teach in person, and we can continue to keep all classes and all schools open. It's absolutely a critical step in getting education back on track.
Robert, when the pandemic forced schools and doctors' offices closed, it also cut children off from the trained teachers and therapists who understand their needs, leading to a worsening of mental health issues. What can parents do to help children cope in these trying times?
This is such an important issue, Priyanka. Thanks so much for raising it. Part of the solution is indeed having this conversation and seeking the support that we all need during this challenging time. The first thing I'd like to recommend is let your child feel their emotions. Let them know it's normal to be sad and frustrated during this very challenging time, and engage with them. Show empathy and support, and know that it's okay to have these feelings. Websites such as ours at UNICEF, but also the World Health Organizations and other websites from trusted organizations have a lot of resources that can be used to help you and engage with your child around issues of frustration and engage with them around these emotions. A second recommendation that I'd offer is to provide distractions and opportunities to continue to engage, whether that be reading or playing a game or talking to their friends or talking to their teachers, or as you mentioned, Priyanka, a professional. Engagement is part of the solution. And that brings me to my third point. Let's continue to ensure that our children are safe online. It's important to know that your children are, that you're there for them, and that you also are supporting them while they're online. Children may face bullying and other forms of risks and abuse online. And so I strongly encourage you to ensure that they continue to be safe at all times online.
Those were really useful tips, and I hope all of you watching found these helpful. Thanks so much for joining us today, Robert.
Thanks again, Priyanka, for this time.
Do drop your comments and any questions that you might have on COVID-19 in the comments section below. We'll take them up in these series as we talk to experts around the world. Thanks so much for watching.